nearly as fast. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Revolution 250 podcast. I am Bob Allison. I chair the Rev 250 advisory group. We are a collaboration among about 70 groups in Massachusetts, planning commemorations of the American Revolution. And our guest today is Shira Lurie. Shira Lurie is an assistant professor of history at St. Mary's University in Halifax, and she is the author of The American Liberty Poll, Popular Politics and the Struggle for Democracy in the Early Republic. Shira, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
So how did liberty polls become a thing, a symbol of protest in the early part of the American Revolution?
What's interesting is they began as not at all a symbol of protest. So after the Stamp Act is repealed, when news reaches New York City of that decision, one of the ways they celebrate is by raising a liberty pole, which for those who don't know is kind of a giant flagpole almost. And so they raise it on the Common, and the flag on that particular liberty pole says George III, Pitt, and Liberty. So it's really a celebration of an empire of liberty, right, of the king, of parliament. So it's not at all a protest symbol initially, but it becomes one because the redcoats that are stationed in New York City take offense for various reasons to this liberty pole. And a few months after it's raised, they go out at night and they cut it down. And it's really that action that transforms the liberty pole from this symbol of gratitude and celebration to the king and empire to one that really is a protest symbol, a symbol of colonial resistance against an oppressive regime. Yeah.
Do we have any idea why they took offense?
Well, I think there are a few reasons we can sort of puzzle out. One is the location of the liberty pole, I don't think was an accident. It's, as I said, raised on the Common, and the Common was kind of a fraught space at this time in New York City. You have the British troops, their barracks are stationed sort of at one end of the Common, and then you have the Sons of Liberty's headquarters, which is a tavern, stationed at the other. So it's already a bit of a tense atmosphere. The liberty pole goes up right in the middle. Okay. And as much as it is a symbol of gratitude and celebration and so on, as I said, it can also be read as, colonists asserting their numerical strength in the city, asserting their rights to control public space and political expression. And so it could be understood that, these redcoats were unhappy with that assertion, right, and maybe, got tired of looking at the liberty pole all day, and so decided to go out and tear it down.
Yeah. And then the Sons of Liberty put it back up. I mean, you have this constant back and forth.
Exactly. So the liberty pole gets taken down almost immediately. Colonists re-raise it. There's a back and forth of raising and destroying that liberty pole in the Common. Eventually, the colonists smarten up a bit and they reinforce their pole with iron around the base. And that does work for a time. The redcoats try twice to blow up that liberty pole. They fail both times. Yes, it gets very intense. Eventually, they do succeed in toppling that liberty pole, and they leave it in pieces on the steps of the Sons of Liberty's headquarters.
Wow.
So
they are demonstrating, they know where this came from, and now we're bringing it back to,
Exactly. So there is a real escalation over time as these liberty poles are toppled and then re-raised.
Then in January of 1770, there's this big episode in New York that turns into what's called the Battle of Golden Hill.
That's right. Yeah. So after that liberty pole is left in pieces on the Sons of Liberty's headquarters steps, they meet at the stump of the liberty pole, and they vow to find and punish those responsible. There is a real sense that a line has been crossed.
Right.
And at the same time, the redcoats are busy going through the city and posting a broadside around that sort of pokes fun at the Sons of Liberty, saying, why do these people think that their liberty is located in a piece of wood? And they blame the Sons of Liberty for the kind of chaos and anarchy that is sort of, taking over the streets of New York City. And so some of the colonists basically confront some of the redcoats as they are posting this broadside. And they get into a little tussle, and the conflict moves to the mayor's home, and then as you say, we get to the Battle of Golden Hill, which is basically the redcoats and the colonists finally coming to blows in a way that they hadn't really before, not in a major way. And there fortunately are no casualties, no fatalities on either side, but there are some injuries, and that quote unquote Battle of Golden Hill precedes the Boston Massacre. So it is a real mark of escalation of tensions in the colonies in general.
It really is. I know the Boston newspapers have pieces about it in February of 1770, so in the lead up to the massacre. And I guess the question then is, how come we know so much about the Boston Massacre, but so little about the Battle of Golden Hill? I mean, I'm thinking about it in the popular memory.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think it does become overshadowed with, the fatalities of the Boston Massacre and also what follows, right? In New York City, the Battle of Golden Hill is more or less the crescendo, like the peak of the tensions. And after that, even, officials are not even wanting people to raise Liberty poles anymore. The Sons of Liberty end up having to raise their replacement pole on private property.
Wow.
So things more or less follow a slight denouement in terms of that particular conflict, mainly driven by officials being alarmed at the potential violence and so on. Whereas, in Boston, things continue to heat up. Yeah.
But you also mentioned how there are Liberty poles being raised in other places, in Farmington, Connecticut, Hanover, Massachusetts. Dedham, just south of Boston, has a monument on the common where their Liberty pole was. So is this... Are these folks also doing it initially as a sign of, hey, we're all part of the empire, or are those symbols of protest when they're being raised?
No, so those Liberty poles do come a bit later, and they follow after word of this conflict in New York City is spreading. And so those Liberty poles that spread mainly throughout the Northeast are absolutely symbols of solidarity, but also as symbols of, we are part of this larger movement. This is us colonists, us patriots, demonstrating that we will not be intimidated, that we will, rise to defend our rights and so on. And when people raise them elsewhere, they say specifically, we kind of dare loyalists or we dare redcoats to tear these down. They will be met with the fury of the people. So it really is an assertion of this movement's strength. And a kind of, it's nothing close to that first Liberty pole anymore.
Interesting. We're talking with Shira Lurie from the St. Mary's University, author of The American Liberty Pole, Popular Politics and the Struggle for Democracy in the Early Republic. I am reminded that this is the 250th anniversary of Taunton, the town of Taunton's Liberty and Union flag, and an important moment in this, as you say, this movement from we're part of an empire to we're asserting a separate identity or a separate belief and challenging anyone to tear this down, which does happen in some places. I know there's a famous case in Barnstable and others where someone does dare to tear down the pole, and they do meet with the fury of, or someone meets with the fury of the mob.
That's right.
Yeah. And then after the revolution and after the Constitution, Liberty poles come back as a really powerful symbol. And this is a big piece of your book, is looking at how these become symbols in the 1790s. So can we talk a little bit about how that happens? Who starts raising Liberty poles and why in the 1790s?
Yeah, absolutely. So Liberty poles, as you say, have a kind of resurgence. The first time when they're re-raised in large numbers is during the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794. And then there's about 40 Liberty poles or recorded Liberty poles raised during the Whiskey Rebellion. And then the other sort of peak period is in 1798 and 1799 in reaction to the Alien and Sedition Acts and the Direct Tax. And there's about 70-ish recorded Liberty poles raised during those periods as well. And so this is really, as you say, the heart of my book. And it's really talking about how protesters who then more and more identify with the Democratic Republicans are using Liberty poles in a lot of ways to organize their resistance, to express their politics and so on, but also, and crucially, to paint the Washington and Adams administrations as the British, right? To paint them as tyrants and to claim as their own identity the legacy of the Patriots. To say, we raised liberty poles during the American Revolution, we're raising them again now because we are being oppressed with tyrannical legislation, with oppressive taxes, and so on. And so when their critics, who more and more identify with the Federalist Party, start cutting down their liberty poles, they just kind of confirm the Federalist identity as redcoats. Right. They're just like.
But do the Federalists say, "Hey, we're right. We are on the side of the oppressor now"? I mean, how are they responding to this? I'm thinking of John Adams and George Washington. You can't find two people more closely associated with the ideas of the Revolution,
right?
And now they're being painted as the oppressors.
Yeah, exactly. So those on the poll raising side are quick to point out the hypocrisy. Right. But those on the Federalist side at the top, but also at the grassroots level, are saying, you've got this all wrong. You Republicans who think that you should be using colonial methods of politics in a republic, it doesn't make any sense, right? Sure, we'll raise liberty poles and have a revolution when we have no voice in government. But the whole point of the revolution was now we have representative government, right? We rule ourselves.
Right.
So to resist legislation and resist an administration that represents the will of the majority is actually, you are the ones who are betraying the revolution, right? The people who are toppling liberty poles, who are supporting the government, they are the ones ensuring that, the will of the majority will stand, that the republic will be defended and strengthened and so on. So it really is a contest about the revolution's legacy and what it means to be a citizen in a republic. What is the citizen's political role? Can you protest can you protest a government in which you've elected your own representatients? It was an open question.
It really is an open question. Samuel Adams raises this during the time of Shays Rebellion, and we see this with the Whiskey Rebellion, and at this time too, there are real threats. Now, do the Federalists also see a tinge of the French Revolution in the raising of liberty poles?
Yes, and they're terrified of that, in particular in that later period when it's pretty common for people to put liberty caps on top of their liberty poles. One liberty pole even flies the French flag.
Oh, wow.
And so this is, a 5-alarm fire for the Federalists. This is terrifying because they look to the French Revolution, of course, as the example of a revolution gone too far, right? They're so grateful and proud that their revolution stopped before it got to the violence and anarchy and chaos that they see in France. So when they see Republicans calling for liberty and equality, and when they see all these French symbols, they're very frightened that these Republicans are not protesting the government or protesting specific pieces of legislation. They are worried that they are trying to overthrow the government. They're trying to start a violent revolution, or they are going to facilitate a French invasion.
Right. And it's not just this particular government, but it's any kind of government. They see these liberty poles as threatening, that they want the kind of anarchy that they see happening in France.
Exactly. Yeah. The key to understanding the first party system is really about that balance between tyranny and anarchy, right? So the classic way to understand it is that the Federalists are worried about anarchy and the Republicans are worried about tyranny. And we definitely see that playing out at the liberty pole.
But you also make the point that the Federalists also are mobilizing the populace. And of course, they can point, as you said, to the fact that they've won elections, that this is an elected government. And so if you don't like the way the election went, is it then legitimate to try to topple those who won? Yeah,
exactly. So, I mean, the Republicans will say, we are protesting particular pieces of legislation and how they'll be enforced in our communities. But the Federalists take that bigger view, as you say, and say you can't undermine a government in which you elected. If you're unhappy with what they're doing, well, vote them out at the next election day. Right now, we have accountability built into our system. The problem in the colonial period was we didn't have that accountability. Right. And so liberty poles, protests, popular organizing, all of that was legitimate back then. It's no longer legitimate. And so the Federalists are often thought of as the kind of conservatives, right, of the first party system. But what I argue is if you look at it in this light, the Federalists are actually proposing a new form of politics. And they are upset with the Republicans for their conservatism, for their clinging to this old, outdated form of politics that now they view as sort of illegitimate and one that is inapplicable to their current situation.
That's interesting. We're talking with Shira Lurie from the St. Mary's University, author of the American Liberty Poll, Popular Politics and the Struggle for Democracy in the Early Republic. And the thing you do really well in this book is showing how each side is mobilizing this popular opinion. Do you think, I don't want you to start naming names of historians who have gotten this wrong, but do you think sometimes we're misled by our sympathies for one side or the other?
I think it's true that historians have tended to focus on Republican popular organizing and how this, growing opposition movement then became a pretty strong political party. And the stories tend to be, here's the Whiskey Rebellion, or here's, Republican 4th of July celebrations and so on, all crucially important to understanding how this two-party system formed. But then the narrative shifts to John Adams, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton. How are they responding to this popular organizing? What we don't get most of the time is, well, how are the Federalists in these communities reacting? Right? Those that have looked at it have tended to kind of looked at Federalist popular organizing again in terms of kind of celebration, 4th of July, some stuff about the Jay Treaty, but it tends to be that, Republicans organize, they have an event. Federalists organize in response, they have an event. But when you look at the Liberty Poll, you see that there are, violent, intimate clashes, people fighting in the streets, people boycotting each other's businesses, people, voting certain ways in local elections. There's all kinds of local politics, local rivalries, local relationships that are playing out in that really intimate way. It's not just kind of a shouting match, right, between events and then how it plays out in the press. So when you look at the Liberty Poll, it is really about how both sides are mobilizing at a grassroots level and then how that ripples out to affect local, state, and national politics.
Yeah. You have a lot actually on Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and Fry's Rebellion. I know the Whiskey Rebellion we know a whole lot about among popular historians. Fry's Rebellion is really less known, but it's really an extraordinary series of events in Pennsylvania. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about what's happening there and what the protests are all about.
Yeah, absolutely. Paul Douglas Newman actually has a wonderful book about this incident. But so the Whiskey Rebellion, of course, is in Western Pennsylvania. What's interesting about Fry's Rebellion is that it's in Eastern Pennsylvania.
I wasn't even saying it right.
Among a totally different population of Pennsylvanians. So they are particularly upset about the direct tax, which is a new tax on houses, land, and enslaved people. That seems very intrusive to them. It involves, property assessors coming and counting the windows of people's houses and that type of thing. So it just really seems like a harbinger of some pretty oppressive taxation to come. And so they start to organize, following similar patterns of the Whiskey Rebellion. They raise Liberty Polls, they organize at the Liberty Polls, they meet there, they pledge their noncompliance and so on. But there's much less violence or threat of violence than there was in the Whiskey Rebellion. That's sort of what's remarkable about this event. And so some tax resistors are arrested and they're taken to an inn, I believe it is, in Northampton, and they're held there pending, transportation for their trial. And John Freeze, a local militia captain, leads, I think it's about 400 people. They go and they want to liberate those tax resistors. He goes into the inn. There's sort of a brief parley, again, totally nonviolent. And they're able to liberate those tax resistors. But John Adams and his administration declares this a rebellion and in troops and so on. So in response, or sort of during this event, there are, scores of Liberty Polls being raised, as I said. And one of the case studies or stories I tell in the book is about this troop from Lancaster on their way to Northampton to assist in the putting down of this so-called rebellion. tear down liberty poles on their way, and they clash violently with local populations. And that incident has tremendous repercussions politically for the gubernatorial election in 1799.
Yeah. So it's not like with the Whiskey Rebellion where you have federal troops mobilized. This is the local militia that's called out, and they're the ones tearing down the liberty poles. And it is, again, a local episode which has this, they are declared to be a rebellion and charged with treason and others. So you have, but it is really this local thing. And we know how people in a community often do have longstanding grudges against each other that come out at a moment like this.
Right, exactly. And we see in the Whiskey Rebellion as well, but also in Freeze's Rebellion, some people are worried. They say, listen, I don't want to tear down this liberty pole. I'm afraid of what these folks are going to do,
Right,
and it takes a troop from further away who is not, within the community or nearby to actually be the ones to tear it down. But yes, it is a kind of remarkable incident also for, the anxieties it produces among people like Thomas Jefferson, who are saying, these people, we are thrilled that they are opposing the Federalists in their legislation, but we are terrified that they are going to do something that's going to paint the Republican Party as anarchists and all the things that we have been accused of being. So the Freezes Rebellion, as it is so close to the 1800 election and so on, is really also a kind of test or a kind of inflection point for the Republican elites who are really nervous about how they're going to walk this line.
Interesting. We're talking with Shira Lurie, author of The American Liberty Pole, Popular Politics and the Struggle for Democracy in the Early Republic. So what happens with liberty poles after this? No, your book focuses on this period, so it's unfair to say so. What happens? Are there liberty poles in the 19th century, or once Jefferson is elected, is this the millennium and we no longer need to have this mass mobilization of opposition?
Yeah, it's a really important question, and the sort of end of the book does go into the 19th century. But basically what happens is Thomas Jefferson is elected. Poll raisers are now feeling more trusting of the government because their guy is in, and they start raising liberty poles in celebration of their, Jefferson's embargo. And, once we get the War of 1812, people are raising liberty poles just as kind of like a patriotic emblem. And there really is a transition once we get to the second party system, where it's no longer about opposing specific pieces of legislation. It is absolutely about supporting one's candidates. So there is a kind of trust in institutional politics in the second party system that didn't really exist in the first party system. And it is about getting your people elected. So we see tons of liberty polls, way more than we saw in the 1790s in the antebellum era, but they are completely partisan and they are completely focused on electoral politics. They are raised, Hickory polls are raised for Jackson, for instance. Ash polls are raised for Henry Clay. And so Whigs and Democrats raising liberty polls all over the US. It's no longer just a Northeastern phenomenon, but they are like lawn signs, basically. They are about just supporting your candidate. And so in a kind of ironic twist, right, the Federalists fall from power. They're never again to be a force in American politics. And yet their idea of politics more or less won, right? It does become about elections. It does become about a trust in institutional politics and just getting the right people in power. And so protest in many ways becomes a little bit more of a fringe phenomenon, right? People who are protesting in the ways that those in the 1790s are seen as, mobs, they're seen as immigrants, they're seen as criminals and so on. It's people like moral reformers who are seeking political change through petitions and elections and so on that are seen as resisting correctly, right? That they're trusting the institutional process. So it really is a remarkable transformation that happens with the second party system. And one I think that tells us a lot about the development of American political culture and its institutions.
It really does. And it does get to that whole question of how does the American Revolution avoid, say, the fate of the French Revolution or others, because you do have this creation of a political system which allows for these big grievances to be fleshed out through a party system.
Yes, absolutely. And this is what, those who have a stake in the system will point to, right? That,
Mhm.
in the second party system now, political parties are seen as positive, right? Where they weren't in the first
Right.
party
Yeah,
system, right?
everyone, Jefferson, Washington, all thought political parties were a bad thing.
Exactly. But now people are sort of saying, okay, we have this institutional system where we understand that peaceful transfers of power between parties can happen and will
Yeah.
happen,
Mhm.
and that parties are actually a way to represent minority interests and keep politicians accountable and all these things that we now think of when we think of political parties. And that wasn't the case, obviously, in the 1790s. And so you don't need liberty poles to some people, you don't need them to be protest symbols. You need them to be galvanizing symbols to turn out people at
Right.
elections.
Interesting. We're talking with Shira Lurie from the St. Mary's University in Halifax, author of the American Liberty Poll. Now, you began actually interested in political philosophy, and do you think being something of an outsider to the American system, although an observer of it, has allowed you to look at this in a more nuanced way or a more objective way than if you had grown up in it or been part of it?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think being Canadian and studying American history and American politics, um, it's sort of fascinating because Canadians are really not that interested in their history and they don't know it
Mhm.
very well. And that's obviously not the case with Americans who know it very well and
We
do
hope, yeah.
more. Yes, well, I would say yes. They think they know their history very well
Yeah.
sometimes, and people have fought and died over interpretations of American
Right.
history, and that's
Right.
sort of more or less a foreign concept in Canada. So I think maybe one thing that I am granted is a kind of um, curiosity about certain ideas or people that maybe wouldn't come naturally to me if I was born in
Mhm.
America. Um, but I say all the time, I find America frustrating, but I love Americans. So, part of what this book is saying is liberty poles are not, a lost golden era. The 1790s is not a perfect political system that was then replaced by, something terrible. It's sort of about the idea that there is nothing set in stone about the way American politics works, right?
Right.
There's no divine revelation handed down in the Constitution and so on. People fought then; they're fighting now about what
Mhm.
American politics should look like. And so, the ultimate point that I make in the book is that you know we can make American politics fairer. We can make American politics look different than it does now because it's not set in stone. As I said, it was
Right.
people made choices at certain times about how American politics would look. Other people made choices at different times. We can choose again, right? We could choose differently.
Very well put. Yeah, we're talking with Shira Lurie, author of the American Liberty Poll. And the epilogue of your book is called Forgetting While Remembering. And here we have this fascinating epic of the Liberty Polls, which have been pretty much forgotten. Golden Hill, we don't remember. The
Right.
Boston Massacre, we do. And why do you suppose that is? How come these are, most historical events we know are forgotten, and even by Americans. And so I wonder how it is that these are forgotten and what is remembered about them.
Yeah, and I will just say, forgetting while remembering is Alfred Young's phrase, Al Young's phrase.
Yeah. Yeah.
So lest people credit me with that genius, it is not mine. So what's interesting is, the Liberty polls that are more or less remembered. I mean, they're not remembered well, but there are
Mhm.
paintings to certain Liberty polls in certain communities on the 4th of July. They'll raise Liberty polls, that type of thing. All those Liberty polls are those American Revolution Liberty polls. The
Yeah.
1790s Liberty polls are completely forgotten.
Right. Right.
There's no popular memory of them whatsoever. And I think that really does speak to this idea that Americans have that there is a kind of key to American politics and the success of America that lies in the founding era, right? That there is,
Mhm.
if only we could understand truly deeply what the founders wanted, if only we could understand truly deeply what the revolution
Yeah.
was about, so many things would be better, right? We just need to kind of unlock that truth. But what
Mhm.
the 1790s Liberty polls show is that there was no truth, right?
Right.
People fought and again, at the local levels, but also at the national levels, about what this revolution had been about, how the republic was supposed to operate, what it meant to be a citizen, not a subject. All of these things, as we said, were open questions. They were debated. They informed how people voted. They informed which parties people joined. They informed, again, those local rivalries and relationships. And so, were we to remember the 1790s Liberty Poll, we would have to reckon with that instability in the founding era. We would have to reckon with the idea that the Constitution, those founding documents, they didn't lay out answers to these questions,
Right.
And they haven't been solved.
Right. It's actually very reassuring in this turbulent, contested era we live in to understand that the era of Jefferson, Madison, Washington, Hamilton, Adams was just as contested, and in some cases even more so. And thinking that the fate of the world rests on what we're doing immediately, and that we don't have the answers, they're saying. I mean, they had answers in the 1780s for a certain set of political problems, and then hashing out in the next decade, and which we've been hashing out over the subsequent couple of centuries.
Yeah, absolutely. As you say, the stakes felt enormous then, like they do now, right?
Yeah.
It does feel as though almost the fate of the world rests on American politics sometimes, and it absolutely did to many players in the 1790s, 1780s. But it was, as you said, right? They found solutions to particular problems. There were people making choices. That's how history happens, really, right?
Yeah, it does.
Most of the time, sometimes there's a volcano or something, but most of the time, history happens with people making choices at certain times. And so they were responding to their own set of circumstances, and certain people made choices, and other people didn't get to make those choices. And so to look in that period for some kind of silver bullet for the current issues facing America and the world, I think is really a fool's errand, more or less. I think, there are institutions that are crying out for reform in American politics. I think there are, a lot of things, a lot of areas in which modern Americans need to make their own choices. And, history is a wonderful thing, but if it does anything, it reminds us that, we made the world we live in, and we can unmake it and make it differently if we want to.
We have it in our power to begin the world over again, as one of these characters said. Were there any people you found particularly interesting in doing the study of Liberty polls?
Yes, I was really drawn to the local characters that I uncovered, and there's one chapter in the book that is about this kind of cohort of what I call itinerant Republican activists. So these are people who we've never heard of before, who there's almost no record of, who are traveling through the Northeast in particular, kind of stirring up anger at the Federalists, really specifically talking about economics, specifically talking about Federalists trying to hoard wealth, to turn regular people into peasants, to take all their land, to force them to be renters their whole lives, and that type of thing. And they inspire Liberty polls, where they travel, and it's remarkable because you do find, once you're looking for it, these glimpses of Federalist elites being concerned about this kind of grassroots activity, that there are people kind of traveling around drumming up opposition, and it's not something that, again, is well documented. You really have to kind of know what you're looking for and find glimpses where you can, but it's a really, I think, fascinating story and a fascinating kind of window into what's happening in these local communities, where, a guy comes in preaching about the Federalists, really telling some scary stories about what's going to happen if this direct tax, is just the first of many taxes to go through, and so on. They leave, Liberty poll goes up, and chaos ensues in that community.
Wow. Outside agitators.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's right. We've been talking with Shira Lurie from the St. Mary's University in Halifax. He's the author of The American Liberty Poll, Popular Politics and the Struggle for Democracy in the Early Republic. Thanks so much for joining us, Shira.
Thanks so much. I've had a great time chatting with you.
I have too. And I want to thank Jonathan Lane, our producer, as well as our listeners. We have folks tuning in from all around the world, and every week I thank some. And if you are in one of these places or you just want to connect with us, send Jonathan Lane an email, jlane@revolution250.org. And this week, particular thanks to our listeners in Lyon, France, and in Maynard, Massachusetts, and Lodi and Lomita in California, Lakeland, Florida, Auburn, Virginia, and all places between and beyond. Thanks for joining us. And now we will be piped out on the road to Boston.